Welcome to part 3 of the video series about Louis XIV. In this video, we will discuss the Franco Dutch War, Versailles, and Louis's first health problems. Between 1665 and 1667, the French army had expanded from 50,000 to 80,000 soldiers. Because Spain failed to come up with the amount that they owed on the dowry for his marriage with Maria Theresia, Louis XIV believed he was entitled to the lands of the Spanish Netherlands instead. So, 3 French armies marched towards the Spanish Netherlands at the beginning of 1667. The strongest army was led by Marshal Turenne, and Louis XIV joined him as his apprentice. The Spaniards were overrun by the French, and cities such as Tournai, Oudenaarde and Douai fell fairly quickly. Only Lille was able to withstand the French siege for a while. The French advantage caused great concern in the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. Hence, the Dutch quickly signed a treaty with the English. However, Johan de Witt, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, managed to join an alliance with England and Sweden against France, called the Triple Alliance, which forced Louis to sign a treaty with Spain. Much of the territory France conquered was returned by the treaty, but Louis could keep some territory in the Spanish Netherlands, such as Lille and Oudenaarde. Of course, the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands had to learn that it should not get in the way of the great Sun King. That is why the diplomacy of Louis XIV took on an aggressively anti-Dutch character. By means of bribery, he managed to get Sweden to leave the Triple Alliance. He also tried to drive a wedge between the English and the Dutch by supporting Charles II of England. Ultimately, Louis' scheming with Charles II resulted in the secret Treaty of Dover, in which the British King Charles II formally cancelled his support of the Dutch Republic. In return, Louis would give him £2 million. This could even become £3 million in case of a possible war against the Republic. In the meantime, Johan de Witt was deceived into thinking that a favorable agreement for his Republic could still be reached with France. But Louis XIV wanted revenge on the Republic for its role in the War of Devolution, and so the Franco Dutch War began. In the meantime, Louis XIV had to deal with rioters on the home front. Some noblemen were plotting against the king. They were hoping to depose Louis XIV and wanted to replace him with his underage son, Louis the Grand Dauphin. However, on September 11, 1674, the conspirators were arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille. Meanwhile, the Franco-Dutch War continued. But in 1678, France grew tired of waging war and pushed for peace negotiations to start. The negotiations turned out favorably for France as their northern borders were fortified. The successful negotiations earned Louis the nickname Louis the Great in reference to Alexander the Great, but the war turned William III into a lifelong enemy of France. Furthermore, the burden on the French treasury had been enormous. Although Louis was an absolute monarch, he was assisted by the Conseil d'un Hôte when it came to governing domestic affairs. The council met in Versailles, the place where Louis also gathered the French nobility around himself. For years, the noble families had been able to do as they pleased, and with the Fronde still fresh in his mind, Louis XIV wanted to keep an eye on them. The reason that the Sun King chose Versailles is because in his younger years, Louis XIV regularly withdrew to the Versailles hunting lodges built by his father. However, the castle lacked the necessary facilities to meet the king's demands. In 1662, Louis XIV gave the order to embellish the castle and make it more comfortable. During the Franco-Dutch War, construction was delayed, but after the war, construction activities were increased again. It was not until 1682 that Louis XIV took up permanent residence in Versailles. At the death of Louis XIV, the construction of the castle had not yet been completed. Around 1680, the court of Versailles was startled by the so-called Poison Affaire, in which several members of the French aristocracy were accused of poisoning and witchcraft. In an attempt to get to the bottom of this scandal, King Louis XIV ordered a major investigation, not sparing even Louis's mistress, Madame de Montespan. 218 people were arrested, 65 people were sentenced to life in prison, and 36 people were executed. By stimulating the domestic economy and industry and by heavily taxing Dutch products, Colbert managed to partly restore the French treasury. But Colbert died in September 1683 and no skilled replacement was found. In the same year, Louis's wife, Maria Theresia, died as well. Shortly after her death, the king secretly remarried his mistress, Françoise de Maintenon. For a biography on Madame de Maintenon, you can click on the link in the upper right corner. In 1682, Louis XIV angered Pope Innocent XI for interfering with the finances of the French churches. The conflict escalated further when the Pope refused to recognize new bishops in France, with the result that in 1685 35 bishops' seats were vacant. Louis XIV tried to regain favor with the Pope by the persecution of the Huguenots in France. On October 22, 1685, Louis XIV went one step further and signed the Edict of Fontainbleau. In doing so, he ended his grandfather's tolerant religious policy and banned Protestantism. In all, about 200,000 Huguenots migrated from France after the new edict came into effect. However, Louis's harsh treatment of the Huguenots did not improve the relationship between himself and the Pope. After the Sun King actively interfered with the succession of the Prince Bishop of Cologne in 1688, he was excommunicated. As Louis grew older, his health started to deteriorate. An operation on his molars broke his upper jaw, which meant that the king could no longer eat or drink normally for the rest of his life. Because he could not chew properly, he also suffered from problems with his intestines. 1 year after the fatal jaw operation, he developed an anal fistula, which was not operated successfully until 6 months later. In addition, he developed gout attacks. This concludes part 3 on my series about Louis XIV. In my next video, I will talk about the later years in the reign of Louis XIV. If you're interested in this, I hope to see you next week.